All right, there we have it. Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu speaking together at the Prime Minister's residence in Jerusalem. Netanyahu, who in his speech talked about the common issues that are bringing together old enemies, and he's talking about Arab leaders that could help to create the conditions for a realistic peace. Donald Trump adding for his part, echoing that statement, saying at one point, there's a lot of love out there. I want to welcome back our panelists here in the France 24 debate. Efraim Inbar, Professor Emeritus of Political Studies at Bar-Ilan University, founding director of the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies, is with us from Jerusalem. Salman Al-Ansari is in Riyadh, founder and president of the Saudi American Public Relations Affairs Committee, former U.S. diplomat William Jordan, and from Washington, Iranian-American journalist and commentator Negar Mortazavi. Let me begin with you, Efraim Inbar. The words we heard from Benjamin Netanyahu hinting that there could be some thaw with Arab countries. What would that be for you?
Well, I think there is nothing new since the major countries in the Middle East see Iran as a big threat, and they are facing aggression all over. So they rely on Israel, particularly when the Obama administration seemed to disengage itself from the region.
Is having a common enemy enough to seal a bond?
Listen, we are realists in terms of international relations. Interest is what counts. What does a bond mean? If you want to the same thing, it's a bond. We're not talking about love. The Arab world will not love Israel because of cultural and religious reasons. So what is important is common interest. This is why we have a peace. Israel has a peace with Egypt because of common interest. This is why Israel is at peace with Jordan because of common interest. So if there are a new common emerging interest, there is a chance for those countries to have better relations with Israel, particularly when there is greater awareness that the Palestinians are not in for a peace process. They have to be forced by the Arab world to enter serious negotiations with Israel and to make concessions. So I think it's quite clear what's all about.
William Jordan, what was your reaction listening to Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu just now?
Well, it's a lot of familiar rhetoric. I mean, in some respects, some of what Donald Trump was saying could have been written by Barack Obama's. Remember, Trump was largely talking about what he had accomplished in Saudi Arabia, and a lot of that could have been written by Barack Obama's White House towards the end of the administration's second term, simply because Obama himself had been forced by circumstances back into the long-standing American tendency to support the Saudis in the face of either an Iranian threat or in order to protect long-standing U.S. interests, security, and otherwise with the kingdom. I mean, I think that, this idea that there's a new spirit of love in the region, there's a new spirit of, a desire to move things forward. It's kind of sort of a, well, okay, let's see what you actually have to propose to the various parties and whether there is a new momentum or anything behind it. I think that the idea of somehow this convergence, as was just said, or has long been speculated, between Israeli interests and Sunni Arab interests, particularly Saudi Arabia, faced with an aggressive Iran. That's been talked about a long time, but it's rather naive to believe that there's enough of a commonality of interest, especially since, given what's just been happening in Iran with the recent elections, where you have the moderate camp reinforced by, the ballot. The tensions within Iran are going to be continuing to play out internally between hardliners and more moderate factions. There has been even the Trump administration has had to acknowledge that there is no clear evidence yet that Iran has failed to live up to the international agreement on its nuclear program. So, I'm not sure that we're at the turning point of a new era in the Middle East But this sort of thing has been talked about from time to time. We have to see if President Trump or anybody else brings new energy either in dealing with the core Palestinian issue, or whether this coalition, which has basically existed for a long time to fight extremism, somehow takes on a new and different form that leads not merely to a restatement of long-standing platitudes, but real actions to counter the generators and drivers of extremism in the region.
All right. Donald Trump singling out Iran. Big crowds, while William Jordan mentioning it at the same time, turning out to celebrate the re-election of Hassan Rouhani and defy the hardliners inside the country. There were even chants Friday night calling for the freeing of opposition leaders who'd been under arrest since 2009. Rouhani saying Saudi Arabia would be stronger if it let its people vote on. Meanwhile, his foreign minister has been tweeting. Here's what Javad Zarif had to say, that when it comes to Saudi Arabia and its role, that fresh from elections attacked by the President of the United States in that bastion of democracy and moderation, a touch of irony when he's referring to Saudi Arabia. Is it foreign policy when Donald Trump goes to Iran, or to Saudi Arabia, excuse me, or simply milking the kingdom because of those defense contracts? Negar Mortazavi, we're seeing this rhetoric that's quite tough, the divide which has really shifted to those that are with the Saudis and Israel against Iran and Iran itself. And at the same time, as William Jordan said, a lot of these talking points sound familiar. We also know that the U.S. Secretary of State has been leaving the door open for continued talks with Iran. William mentioning that the Trump administration is not saying that the Iranians are in breach of the 2015 nuclear accord. Are things different under Donald Trump, or are they the same?
Well, it looks like when it came to practice, as far as the nuclear deal, it hasn't changed under Donald Trump. The White House has just renewed a waiver of sanctions, which happens every few months, which is something the Obama administration had been doing. And everybody was so concerned and worried that when Trump comes into power, given the rhetoric he had against the nuclear deal with Iran, that he's going to blow that up. And that didn't happen. And that's just an indication, I think, of how solid and strong that deal was. That we all know it's not just between Iran and the U.S. There were other major world powers, including France, involved. It was a rigorous process. It took 2 years, a lot of time and effort from top diplomats in all these countries. So that's something. The nuclear deal that's solid, and I think it's very hard to break or derail. And in fact, I think that's also a good example of how you make deals if you're really serious and concerned about peace. Not by this type of, I think Donald Trump's honestly is the trip is a political show for both his domestic, part of his domestic support when it comes to the type of unconditional support that he seems to be providing to Israel on this trip. And also there's definitely economic concerns in this trip that he has. We see that he starts in Riyadh by that $1 billion arms deal with the Saudis. But also from an Iranian perspective, I want to mention, this is something that's been discussed in Iranian social media. We just saw, you also showed videos of Iranians dancing on the street for re-electing a moderate, for moderation, for the agenda of cooperation and re-engagement and peace with the world. And Iranians are saying the dance of peace is coming out of Iran. And at the same time, you see images of Donald Trump dancing with the dictators in Saudi Arabia with swords. And Iranians are calling that the dance of war. So putting these two images next to each other in contrast, it just seems like how inappropriate and untimely this trip has been, considering what's just happening in Iran and the rhetoric that he's taking against Iran in this trip. I think it's definitely not beneficial to the moderates in Iran. He's in fact strengthening and emboldening the hardliners in all these capitals, in Tehran, in Riyadh, and in Tel Aviv. And it's not going to be beneficial to anybody else in the Middle East in the future term, because if you want peace and stability, Iran has to be part of the equation. And just by taking blind sides in these very complex issues, you're not going to help either side of the equation, I think.
Not going to help either side of the equation. Salman al-Ansari, on that score, Donald Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia, you heard the criticism there. Was it about doing deals, or was it really about going beyond just rhetoric when it comes to fighting terror, for instance?
Great. I think definitely the Trump's visit to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has an unprecedented strategic importance, not only to the region, but to the whole world when it comes to global security, when it comes to combating terrorism. And the thing is going on right now in Riyadh and in Saudi Arabia is the fact that Saudi has reactivated its stance as having like the capital, Riyadh, to be the capital of the Arab and Muslim nations and to be the capital of the efforts on combating terrorism, and at the same time the capital of economic transformations and development in the region. So there are a lot going on in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia with Vision 2030 is moving towards a very fast, pragmatic kind of steps to diversify its economy, to make a lot of opportunities for the Saudi youth. We are having more than 70% of the Saudi population under the age of 30. So we are speaking of a very basically progressive leadership in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, specifically Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who has been always regarded as a very pragmatic personality. And I think Trump saw that there is a very big potential for the Saudi-US relationship to basically solve the issues in the region and to combat terrorism by all means, specifically the terrorism that has been supported by the Iranian regime, which is very brutal, which is very dangerous, not only to the region, but to the whole world. So I think the Trump's visit to the kingdom has a lot to speak about. It's very strategic. It gets Saudi Arabia to be the main conduit to the Arab and Muslim world. So basically,
but Salman, let me just ask you, because we talk about terrorism, but it just seems a bit vague. Here in France, those who've carried out terror attacks, they're not Iranian-backed. The backing came from hardline Sunni groups, and so the idea of that it's the terrorists on one side and those who are working for peace on the other, isn't that a bit simplistic?
Not at all. Let me tell you something, and thank you so much for highlighting this. Basically, when it comes to terrorism, there is no such thing as Sunni terrorism and Shia terrorism. Terrorism should always be defined as terrorism, as I always say.
Agreed.
And when it comes to Iran, I'm getting there. When it comes to Iran involvement, let's speak about the facts. The fact says that the Treasury Department of the United States has, in multiple times, said in reports that Iran is sponsoring Al-Qaeda operatives within Iran and giving them logistic support, etc. Let's look at what Osama bin Laden himself said, that he was actually giving a message to his followers in Al-Qaeda that they should never be attacking Iran because Iran is the logistic hub for supporting and sponsoring their activities. And this has been released by the CIA. So let's speak about another fact. Iran has never been touched or threatened by any terrorist group, neither Al-Qaeda nor ISIS, where when it comes to Saudi Arabia has been attacked 30 times, 30 times just last year by ISIS. So let's not get into the simple idea that, okay, these are Sunni groups, the militias that did, or like the lone wolves that did terrorist attacks and horrendous attacks in in the Western world or here or there, that they are Sunnis. That means that they are not affiliated to Iran. Not at all. Actually, Iran is
William Jordan, let me ask you on this. How do we get beyond what's become a divide that's grown and grown and grown with the horrible civil war that's going on in Yemen, for instance, and what we've seen, of course, in Syria?
Well, first of all, one of the ways I would push back on what we just heard from Riyadh is that for both Sunnis and Shia, whether you want to, and I think it's primarily in the form of the governments that represent in a majority way those tendencies. Terrorism ends up, or support of terrorist groups, to try to inflame the sectarian divides that exist, or to try to create tensions where, in many cases, tensions didn't exist or were not as inflamed as they once were, is the preferred method of proxy warfare. So that between Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, others in the Sunni world versus Iran, and you know, this has been the preferred method sort of dealing with these things. You know, and in that respect, the only way you're eventually going to deal with that aspect of terrorism, in other words, the degree to which it involves a certain proxy warfare that's playing out, and you can see it in places like Syria and Iraq, as well as Yemen, is if there is some kind of a new relationship between Iran and its Arab neighbors. That's the first thing I would say. The other part, though, I mean, when you're talking about, you were referring to the terrorism that's reached France and other countries in the West, as well as hitting, you know, large swaths of the Arab world, the Muslim world. I mean, that has a lot to do with localized conditions. That has a lot to do with a sense of alienation. That has a lot to do with a sense of detachment, which can be social, economic, political, religious in nature. I mean,
we're getting far and away from the topic at hand, which is, of course, this whether or not there can be this new dynamic. And again, it brings us back to the question that we asked Ephraim Inbar at the outset, which was whether or not having a common enemy can stir a bond. Ephraim responding, that's not enough. Let me ask you, Ephraim, on this. Egypt and the president of Egypt visited Jordan at the end of March. And there seems to be something going on when we hear Netanyahu there talking about how there are perhaps conditions for a normalization with some of Israel's Arab neighbors. Is something happening on that front?
Well, first of all, we see economic interactions. Everybody knows that there are many Israelis in the Gulf doing wonderful business. There is a lot of intelligence interactions, of course, under the table. And there is a growing cooperation between Israel and its Arab neighbors, primarily against Iran. You know, the talk I heard on this show about the moderate regime in Iran is self-delusional, because this regime supports the Houthi in Yemen that launched just this week a few missiles toward Riyadh. This moderate regime supports Assad, genocidal policies, ethnic cleansing. So I really cannot understand how decent Americans can talk about this regime in Iran as being moderate. True, they are more extreme, but this regime is definitely not moderate, not speaking about its clear policy to attempt the demise of the State of Israel.
Ephraim, let me ask you on Tuesday.
This is a problem. Iran is a true strategic problem for the region, and unless it is contained, seriously not contained, we'll continue to see polarization in the region.
Ephraim, on Tuesday, Donald Trump will visit the West Bank. He'll go to Bethlehem, with Palestinians this Monday staging a general strike in the occupied territories in support of hunger-striking prisoners held in Israeli jails. There are reports that the visit to the Church of the Nativity has been scrapped. What are you expecting from Tuesday from Donald Trump?
Well, Donald Trump tries to make peace. I think his attempt is very courageous, maybe motivated by narcissistic personality, but I don't think that he has a great chance, particularly when I heard today that the Palestinians want to start negotiations on the basis of Premier Olmert's suggestions in 2007, which, of course, it's not realistic. And this is what Netanyahu speaks about. He speaks about a realistic deal, a deal that will, the Palestinians have to make some concessions. They cannot, they have great appetite and they cannot deliver. As long as there is no unity between Gaza and the West Bank, it's very difficult to see a serious Palestinian partner for peace talks. And as a result of that, he may start like most American presidents with valiant attempts and end like all of them before. Understanding the situation is very complicated, and there are still a lot of energies. One of the main reasons for the continuous Palestinian-Israeli conflict is that both sides still have energies to fight. Let's face it. And, Israelis are ready to fight for Jerusalem, for example, and Hamas is ready to fight for its dream, and the Fatah as well. So this is the situation.
It seems as though the conflict is frozen. William Jordan, 2 weeks from now, will mark the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War. It was a lightning win for Israel. It redrew the map of the region and really defines to this day the balance of power in the Middle East. Is it a given that this is what happened during those 6 days in 1967 is what's going to define the region for the next half century? There's this sort of sense that everything's blocked, everything's frozen.
Well, let me start answering that by pointing out that I believe that the impending 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War was one of the primary reasons why Donald Trump decided to exercise his prerogative as President of the United States and sign the waiver not to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. It would have been a terrible thing to have announced at this time with that anniversary coming up, and for a lot of the reasons that were just mentioned, because you talk about the energies that exist on both sides, Arab, I'll broaden it to Arab and Israeli, in terms of the conflict, the frozen conflict. I mean, they're still there. I mean, I think the question of whether or not, I mean, you talked about these discussions of what was behind the the March Sisi Abdullah meetings in Jordan. I mean, a lot of that speculation, I believe, also centered around the reality. I don't know if it happened. The reality that it's a very short hop from Israel to Aqaba, and Aqaba in Jordan has always been a meeting ground that has brought Israeli prime ministers directly into discussions with the Jordanians and other Arab representatives to try to see what can be done with respect to peace. I mean, there is a window of opportunity here, as was just said. Donald Trump is approaching this on his own. He's got to have to figure out, whether he has a magic formula that nobody else has tried before. What he's going to find out, without any doubt, is that peace between between Palestinians and Israelis is not like, buying or trying to build a hotel on a historically protected piece of property in downtown Manhattan. It's a lot more complicated than that, and it falls not merely to the political will he has to try to bring about a deal, but it ultimately falls to the political will on the Palestinian and Israeli sides to negotiate a deal and then to make it happen.
All right. Ignorance is not bliss, says William Jordan, when it comes to Middle East peace. I want to thank you. I want to thank Ephraim Inbar for being with us from Jerusalem, Negar Mortazavi in Washington, as well as Salman Al-Ansari in Riyadh. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois.
William Jordan telling us, you can't go in blind if you're trying to deal with Middle East peace.
Certainly not. But in any case, there have been images of the trip, blind or not blind, which have been circulating on social media. And one of them is the historical moment of a sitting US president at the Wailing Wall. This hasn't happened before. You've had, for example, Barack Obama, but while he was campaigning to be president, visiting the Wailing Wall. So that is an image, the Western Wall, which has gathered a lot of attention and a degree of derision as well, because, of course, it's a wall. And people are making links to another wall. In any case, we'll get to that. Trump places a note in the Western Wall, and that imagined note says, "My wall will be bigger." We also have Donald Trump. How much for this wall to take back to the border with Mexico? I think that would be all sorts of wrong. Starting with sacrilege. But anyway, we that's not the whole point. The point is derision. This stone would be perfect for my border wall with Mexico. Now, not to be outdone, French cartoonists, Francois, were getting in on the game as well. Plantu, the cartoonist for Le Monde, this was anticipating the visit because the cartoon was published before the actual visit. Do you also have Mexicans? Says, well, this isn't, of course, the Western Wall. This is the border wall or the division wall between Israel and the Palestinian territories. And there he is with Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Abbas, wondering if there were also Mexicans in that part of the world. And similar sort of vein in this particular cartoon by Chesever, Trump wants to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
That necktie is really getting longer, huh?
Yeah.
Gosh.
I hadn't noticed that, but yes, another note of derision in that
True
cartoon.
fashion crime.
And he's asking Mr. Abbas here, he's built a wall. Does he want you to pay for it? And you don't want to pay for it. So I suppose echoes of the dispute between the US and Mexico over that border wall. Now, another moment, Francois, staying away from geopolitics, that has got a lot of attention. There was a moment when Melania Trump appears to have slapped away Donald Trump's hand. You can see here on the red carpet. Now, I think it is a moment worth noting because clearly all of the eyes of the world were or at least cameras were going to be present. So surely she must have known that this was going to be caught on camera. So it is perhaps a revelation of tensions within the first couple. Not, of course, the first time that we've been hearing about that. And there's even this headline in the Daily Beast: Melania's SWAT proves she hates Donald just as much as America does. That would have been...
Talk about jumping to conclusions.
That would have been a daring tweet, never mind a headline in the Daily Beast, but I guess that shows the extent to which...
With the sub-headline, "Shove actually."
Right, there you go. So in any case, maybe she just didn't feel like holding his hand in that particular moment and everything is rosy. We don't know. In any case, another moment that got a certain amount of attention was this little... or ball thing here has been added by Photoshop, but the crossing of hands did happen. It was apparently Benjamin Netanyahu's idea, I suppose, as a symbol of friendship and I don't know what complicity. But of course, you see, this did happen. This was in Riyadh at the well, I'll let the tweet from the Saudi embassy say it. It was at the Global Center for Combating Extremist Ideology in Riyadh. And I suppose it's just a kind of a striking image, which has potential echoes in film, in folklore, whatever. Perhaps try a bit harder to not look like movie villains, guys, and that is Saruman from Lord of the Rings. So there you go. That moment being echoed at the airport there with the various leaders. I'll just finish with this one image. Trump in Israel. Trump may have hoped this trip would take the focus off #TrumpRussia. Of course, all of the allegations of collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, but it won't, and he's already exhausted. In other words, that witch hunt which he speaks about will probably be waiting for him when he gets back.
All right, and it's an 8-day trip, so there'll be plenty to talk about. James Creedon, I want to thank you. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.